and welcome to today's SSP webinar, Sharing Policies, IRs, Author Manuscript versus Preprint versus Version of Record. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, and I am the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group. We are pleased that you could join us today for our discussion. Before we get started and hear from our distinguished panel of speakers, you will be seeing the SSP splash screen while I go over a few housekeeping items. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the chat feature to set to organizers and panelists in the right-hand side in order to send in any questions or to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. All questions will be saved until after the panelists have had their presentation and their chance to speak. Specifying which presenter you'd like to direct your question to will help us, and our moderator will be monitoring those questions and making sure to pose them to the correct person. Also, please send in your questions as we go. You don't need to wait until the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We highly encourage you to provide feedback so that we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to the materials presented. Our moderator today is Jason Point. Jason has spent 25 years in professional and scholarly publishing, most of it with Walter Kluwer. His career path has included several different significant changes, from military history to healthcare publishing, from selling nursing education products to journal advertising, and then from advertising to become a journal's publisher. Most recently, he transitioned from working on the commercial side of the business to the not-for-profit Professional Medical Society as its publications director. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Jason so he can introduce our panel and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everybody. Today I'd like to first just give credit where credit is due. The concept for today's webinar was originated with Sarah Whipperman at Penn Libraries. Sarah unfortunately was not able to join us as a panelist today as she was speaking at another engagement and would not be available. But we do have our two panelists representing both the institutional side of this equation and the commercial publishing side. The first is going to be Kenny Whitebloom with Penn Libraries. Kenny manages Scholarly Commons, the University of Pennsylvania's institutional repository, and he contributes to the broader efforts of the university's digital scholarship group. Prior to his appointment at Penn, Kenny worked as the manager of special projects at the Digital Public Library of America. He previously worked at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University as a project coordinator. Kenny holds an MLIS from the Simmons College School of Library and Information Science, and a BA in History and Italian from Vassar College. Representing the publisher side of this topic is Andrew Weibel from Wolters Kluwer. Andrew is the Senior Manager, Rights, Licensing, and Partnerships for Wolters Kluwer Health, Learning, Research, and Practice based in Philadelphia. He is responsible for overseeing the permissions, licensing, and translation teams for the entire Lippincott, Weems & Wilkins and MedNo Medical, Nursing, and Allied Health Journal and Book Publishing programs. He is a member of the STM Copyright and Legal Affairs Committee and the Association of American Publishers Copyright Committee. And with that, I'm going to hand over first to Kenny to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Jason. Let me just get my slides set up here. All right. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here. As Jason mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the library perspective when it comes to sharing policies and institutional repositories. I hope to cover over the course of my presentation the ways in which libraries are assisting faculty and authors with understanding sharing policies, making sense of copyright transfer agreements, and just generally navigating this space. I also would like to provide an overview of how the University of Pennsylvania has set up a mediated deposit service to assist these faculty members and these authors share their works online via our institutional repository, which is called Scholarly Commons. And then I'd like to conclude with just identifying some of the issues, pain points that we've noticed as we've navigated through these policies over the past few years, and some of the ways that we think publishers and librarians can work together moving forward. Before I get into exactly how libraries, and in particular Penn, are assisting faculty with sharing online via the institutional repository, media deposit, I just want to set the scene very, very, very broadly. As a result of the growth of online culture and digital technology, among so many other technological and societal factors, for everything all familiar, authors are sharing their work online, have been doing so for years. Over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen a significant rise in participation of general academic social networking sites like academia.edu and ResearchGate. And as more scholars have signed on for these services and participated in the social networking aspect of it, we've seen the rise and prevalence of copyright violations, namely in the form of authors posting versions of their works on these services for which they're not legally allowed to share. And this has led to some publishers taking more drastic measures and holding these sites accountable for the copyright violations on their platforms, such as the Coalition for Responsible Sharing. From our perspective, though, a lot of this stems from authors not knowing or being really confused about what exactly they can share and where they can share it. Confusing language on publisher policies or on online web pages and differing terminology compounds the issue. For instance, what's the difference between a preprint and an original version? Is my Facebook page a personal website? Is an institutional repository a company website? Many publishers are approaching sharing policies from different angles, which we think kind of only heightens the confusion. Policy language doesn't match from publisher to publisher, and some publishers don't even have published policies to begin with, or they're really hard to find on their website or elsewhere. We've run into a number of authors who are just getting confused or discouraged, and that results in them going with their gut, which sometimes means posting a final version onto the web. One solution, though, and this has really led to, from the library perspective, seeing libraries take a role in helping authors share their work and understand those sharing policies so they aren't in violation of that copyright transfer agreement on their sharing works legally. For us here at Penn, that's meant creating a robust mediated deposit service to our institutional repository. And the basics of this are pretty simple. You have a faculty member, they upload their CV or list of citations containing all of their works to a librarian here at the University of Pennsylvania. We then review those works, figure out who published each article or each book chapter or what have you, and figure out the publisher policy for each of them, and then deposit what we can into the institutional repository. We really market this as a service to our faculty and authors as a first step before they think about working with an academic social networking site, so that we can really articulate what they can share, when they can share it, and where they can share it, and hopefully reduces the likelihood that they'll put up the wrong version elsewhere on the web. This does mean, though, that we're the ones figuring out the sharing policies, and we see tons of them, but we do run into significant issues in understanding them. And we think that if we're having problems understanding some of these policies, that we can't really expect our faculty or our authors to do much better. To back up just one step, what is an institutional repository? For those of you who aren't familiar, an institutional repository in many cases is really just a digital platform that's going to provide permanent public access to scholarship produced by a university or institution. And it's historically been a place for sharing green open access materials, journal articles, book chapters, things of that nature, working papers. But it can also be used to publish original materials such as open journals or data sets or faculty or student-led projects. It's a bit of a squishy term, and it really varies from institution to institution. Penn's institutional repository is not going to look exactly the same as in other institutions, but that's sort of a good guiding definition. As I mentioned earlier, our institutional repository is called Scholarly Commons. It's been around for 13 odd years at this point, and we have nearly 35,000 items spanning from journal articles to dissertations to data sets to video, audio, a whole range of materials, and we get around 2 million downloads per year. When the repository first started, we had self-deposit. We encouraged authors to put up their materials in accordance with their CTA. The repository manager at the time quickly realized, though, that they were often uploading versions that violated copyright. So a solution to that was this mediated deposit service that I just described, as a way to encourage legal sharing and raise awareness of the fact that this is a legal issue, that authors sign copyright transfer agreements and we don't want to see them violate those. About a year and a half ago, we bulked up this mediated deposit service into something that we now refer to at Penn as faculty-assisted submission. And faculty-assisted submission is essentially a more robust workflow for this mediated deposit. We train and supervise a number of student employees who do sort of like 5 main tasks. The first of which is to review publisher policies for each citation from a faculty member and to make verdicts on the suitability for self-archiving. We go through a pretty rigorous training process so that they're comfortable making these determinations, and we oversee all of that. When they are reviewing these publisher policies, they're looking for a number of things. They're looking for where it can be shared. So in the blue there, where can this work be shared, if at all? And we're looking for, in particular, to an institutional or subject repository. We're also looking for what version can be uploaded to the repository. We're also looking for when, is it after embargo? And then lastly, if there's a required statement that needs to be associated with this particular piece. We also correspond with publishers and journal editors to seek permission or clarification if something's unclear. We upload those papers to the IR and coordinate with the faculty member to send any preprints or postprints that we might need, and are communicating with faculty about the results of the process. And then the final piece in this whole faculty submission process is documenting those policies for future review and quicker reviews in the future. We really rely heavily on public information from publishers, looking up on their website what their sharing policies are, that sort of thing. And we see a lot of them, as you can imagine. We probably go through 50 plus CDs a year at this point, maybe more depending on involvement, and so we see thousands of policies or hundreds of policies. Again, we contact the publisher if anything is unclear, confusing, or if permission is required. And I should also mention here that we don't have CTAs for the most part, so again, we are relying on public information from publishers for most of this. And Penn, generally speaking, is pretty advanced when it comes to mediated deposit support and copyright review. There are a number of universities who do offer mediated deposit, but from my understanding, we're probably the most advanced right now in terms of the scale at which we can accommodate CVs and citations coming in from faculty members who are interested. So since we are seeing so many of these publisher policies, we've noticed some pain points and things that trip up the work that we're trying to do in coordination with authors. The first is that existing resources out there can be really helpful, but they aren't always reliable or totally relevant to the context of your institutional repository. So Sherpa Romeo is a public database of publisher policies. It's helpful, but it's oftentimes what we've noticed, the records are out of date or they're incomplete, or we can't fully trust that it's been vetted in the past 12 months. So we are often just turning back to the publisher policy itself and looking at that. Often on publisher policies, folks are pointing to Copyright Clearance Center or RightsLink, which isn't always relevant to self-archiving on institutional repository. That's more geared towards reuse permissions for all other purposes downstream. Secondly, there isn't really a standardized language on versioning. From publisher policy to policy, we'll see preprints described differently. And we have created sort of a go-to key that we use with our students to sort of spell out all these different versions. And it can be confusing. It's confusing for us, and we think that it's confusing for authors, and we notice that when we can communicate with them seeking preprints to be uploaded to the repository. So this is just, again, an image that we use to help clarify the different versions. But as you can see, there are a handful of different ways of describing the same thing, and that makes it difficult when you're moving from policy to policy. It's also sometimes unclear where exactly a paper can be uploaded and how the institutional repository fits into it. what is exactly a website? Is an IR a company website? Is it a personal website? We're often really looking for specific keywords or language. We're really looking for the word institutional repository. And when that's not available, it becomes unclear whether or not it's part of the uploading or the sharing process. We also encounter policies that have overly sort of like legalese language. They're hard to parse. I know that, of course, CTA is a legal document, but when it comes to reading and parsing these public pages describing where, when, and how papers can be shared, it makes it difficult when it's a little bit legal sounding. And sometimes these contradict themselves, and we think that it probably could be a little more straightforward for many cases. And then lastly, we work with faculty at many different stages in their career, and when we encounter a faculty member who's been publishing for 30, 40 years, they don't have digital versions of their preprints or ever a copy of their preprint at all, and so we don't know what to do in those cases. Older works for which the preprint is just not able to be obtained, and we think that there could be some policies for that. So some suggestions from us, I should say, include developing some guidelines around language so that we all know what a preprint is and are talking about it the same way. And we don't, of course, want to see this as mandatory language needs to be used, but maybe just guidelines that people can all draw on. Including civic language about IRs in a policy is really important. As I mentioned, we are looking for that. And this is important to universities and faculty as well, as more universities are encouraging faculty to deposit into institutional repositories, and funding agencies are using IRs as a component of their grant providing mechanisms. We also think that public information about the policies should be really easy to understand and also easy to find. Sometimes we are looking for policies and it's not clear where exactly they are. They're all sort of under different parts of websites, and that's not necessarily that every policy or every website needs to have the same architecture, but just thinking about how readily accessible it is from the perspective of the author or a librarian who's working with an author. We would also love to see policies for sharing older articles, as I mentioned. This fifth point is maybe a little bit blue sky, but thinking of ways to provide authors with continued access to the preprints and postprints would make the likelihood that final versions are online less likely. For every one author that we work with who has all of their preprints, we have about 10 who don't have their preprints or don't know where they are or don't know which version is. And so if we could have access to them, or if the author could have reliable continued access to them, we think that it would make it much easier and more likely that they are going to share those in accordance with sharing policies. And then lastly, continue to support green open access. A lot of authors that we work with can't afford Gold OA, or the library fund that's been designed to support Gold A extinguishes pretty quickly. So continuing to support self-archiving through a green open access policy is something that we would just love to see, and just want to highlight that. I do want to say, however, that we want to collaborate with you on these suggestions. My colleague Sarah Whipperman couldn't be here, but she is keen to collaborate, as am I, with publishers and you all, so that we can advance our common goals of disseminating research and information. Before I turn it over to Andrew, though, I just want to throw out some questions that maybe we can address later on, just sort of, or food for thought, really. Do you know what your sharing policies are, and have you ever read another publisher's sharing policies? Do you ever get questions from authors about what they can and cannot share? What are your sharing policy pain points? And then lastly, prior to this presentation, did you think of libraries as sort of being a player in this space or being part of this space when it comes to CTAs, sharing policies, and the like? My email's there at the bottom, as is Sarah's. We would love to hear from you. If you're keen to collaborate, please be in touch with us. Thank you so much for listening to my part of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrew now.
Hey, actually, this is Jason, just intervening very quickly before Andrew starts his presentation. We're getting some excellent questions, and I just wanted to mention, because I forgot to at the start, we're going to hold questions until after the presentations. and then I'll parse the questions appropriately to the respective presenters. But thank you for the questions we've received so far. Keep them coming in. Andrew, go ahead.
All right, thanks a lot, Jason. Thanks a lot, Kenny. Kenny, hopefully I'll be able to answer a couple of your questions. Won't be able to touch on all of them, but hopefully get to a few. So I'm going to try to shed some light on the various publisher policies and industry language that appears to be muddying the waters of what can be shared. And then we'll also try to provide some insight into what Wolters Kluwer and some of our industry peers are working on to better communicate this messaging to our various valuable partners. So as publishers, we all speak the same language. We understand the difference between a preprint, an author's manuscript, or a version of record. Yet, no matter how many policies we seem to post or info pages we develop, in many cases, what sounds common to us might be completely foreign or at the very least ambiguous to our authors, societies, and institutions with whom we work very closely every single day. I mean, just this week I fielded a sharing question from one of our society partners, even though we have sharing policies spelled out twice on our website and an author's document openly available. So obviously something is getting lost in communication here. So standardizing language across the hundreds of scholarly publishers may prove to be an insurmountable task, but if we're to continue upholding and enforcing copyright as publishers, we need to give our authors, societies, and institutions the clear sharing information they need. I mean, ultimately, as Kenny mentioned, we know they want to work within the bounds of copyright, just as we as publishers want them to be able to share their work in a productive manner. But our partners may not be able to interpret the various dialects of the publishing language. So as we try to decode the myriad of terms used to identify various stages of the publishing cycle and what they mean for authors, let's take a look at the most common sharing principles among scholarly publishers. What publishers commonly refer to as the preprint is the first step in the process. It's the version of the article that the author submits for publication consideration. It's typically the form of a one-column Word or processor file and free of any formatting, typesetting, or peer review. Most publishers, including Wolters Kluwer, allow this version to be shared anywhere, anytime, with anyone. And this includes through institutional repositories and also preprint servers, because we understand the value that repositories and servers add to the collaboration process. When the article publishes, authors should add a DOI link to the published article alongside the preprint so the readers are able to see the best version of the article. We want to direct them to the best version, and there's a good chance they may have access to it even if it's sitting behind a paywall. And if a preprint is posted to a server includes a DOI, the published article will have a new DOI, which should also be linked to. And with all versions, and you'll hear me repeat this as we go on, with all versions of an article, once the final version is published, the preprint cannot be altered in any way to make it appear more like the published version. So once an article has been accepted and gone through the entire peer review process, it's considered a postprint or a peer-reviewed manuscript or an author's manuscript or an accepted manuscript. So I get what Kenny's saying. There's 4 different phrases for the exact same type of document here. But regardless of how publishers name it, the stage typically looks like, again, a single-column Word file. It often contains a watermark and may include the word accepted somewhere in the document and may also have a copyright line. Accepted manuscripts do not contain any other publisher value adds beyond the peer review. These include copy editing, formatting, typesetting. It does not include any of those. And they can typically, and how they can be shared depends on the embargo period. And for most publishers, the embargo period is 12 months from the date of publication of the final article in the journal. During the embargo, authors can share the accepted manuscript on internal institutional repositories for most publishers. So these are repositories that can only be accessed by members of the institution, within the institution. And most publishers also allow the accepted manuscript to be shared in small research groups that are around the same size as a typical in-person research group, 10, 15, 20 researchers, but something that is closed off to the wider world. And has to be, people need to be invited and accepted, and then the article has to be shared directly. Pre-embargo manuscripts can also most often be shared on an author's personal website or blog. So these include websites where authors detail their research or list all of their published works, presentations, assignments, etc. It does not include commercial social media networks. They're not considered author websites. After the embargo period has passed, authors can share their manuscripts via any institutional repository, including those that are external facing. And they can also be shared via non-commercial scholarly collaboration networks. Non-commercial is a key term that you'll hear throughout. And as with preprints, accepted manuscripts should always contain a DOI to the final article when it publishes, and they may not be altered to more closely resemble the final article. And some publishers, not all, but some, require accepted manuscripts to contain a non-commercial open access license, which can be added to the copyright page of the article. Finally, the most visible article type is the version of record, VOR for short, or the published article. It's the final version of the article after peer review, copy editing, typesetting, formatting, and every other publisher value add. It appears in the print or online journal and is typically in PDF form. It's called the version of record because it is the version the publisher formally and exclusively declares as the preeminent version of the article. Any reference or citation to the article should be to the version of record because it is the best version. Most publishers do not allow sharing of the VOR, especially to large groups, but do encourage authors to share the final abstract or the accepted manuscript along with a DOI link to the VOR. Most publishers will allow authors to share the VOR with small groups of colleagues, and some will also allow the VOR to be shared via closed scholarly collaboration networks. These are closed ones where a researcher must invite their colleagues to join, where users can only share the articles within a small group of invitees. So this is not the first time I've had this discussion, and I imagine it won't be the last. So what can we do as publishers to clarify the message? I mean, we all have sharing guidelines on our sites, but questions still persist. At Wolters Kluwer, we're working on delivering the message more clearly to societies as part of our regular meetings. We also want to reach authors within their normal workflows. For example, all WK authors receive an email when their article publishes, which includes a link to the article as well as other pertinent details. We're in the process of adding sharing guidelines to this email so authors can clearly see how they can share their articles at the time of publication and post-publication. And as an industry, the International Association of STM Publishers, STM, and several of its members, including Wolters Kluwer, have developed HowCanIShareIt.com. It essentially acts as a clearinghouse with links to the sharing guidelines of several STM publishers. So people like Kenny and his mediated depositors don't have to go out and search through 50 different websites. They can just click links through HowCanIShareIt.com and get right to the site where they need for the guidelines. The website also includes the valuable Can I Share It lookup tool, and it allows authors to input the DOI of their article and see the permissible sharing options, which provides the most precise guidelines down to the article level. So while getting hundreds of scholarly publishers to begin using the exact same language may be arduous at best, we are taking steps to try to make sharing options more clear. We fully understand the importance sharing and collaboration play in fostering innovation and the advancement of scholarly literature. We also know that an overwhelming majority of our authors and partners want to share in a copyright-compliant way. But as publishers, we need to make our policies clear, transparent, and as accessible as possible. I mean, sometimes we may get too deep into our own world and assume everyone understands our unique publishing language. But hopefully, conversations like this will foster commonality and clarity to help our authors and institutional partners more efficiently and effectively share their copyright and their content in copyright compliant ways. And with that, we'll open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Kenny. And we do have a number of excellent questions for both of you. First, I'm going to start with Kenny. There were a couple questions that apply specifically to, I think, PEN, but also just generally, if you can speak for institutions. Specifically at PEN, and then generally with your knowledge of other IRs, are IRs, are institutional repositories typically publicly available outside the university, or are they only available to current university entitled individuals?
Sure. Typically, institutional repositories are going to be publicly available outside the university. At Penn, our institutional repository, Scholarly Commons, is publicly available to anyone with an internet connection. Individual records in our repository can be restricted based on IP address or IP range, so just folks who are on Penn's network. You can also set up restrictions based on sort of membership, based on email address and user account credentials. I would say that's pretty typical. I would say the default for institutional repositories is going to be publicly available unless you have specific collections or items that are going to be restricted based on some sort of parameters. And that's dependent on the platform and the interests of the group, but I think it's safe to say that most institutional repositories are going to be publicly available to most people.
So sort of a related question. What is the difference in scope or purpose between an institutional repository, such as yours at Penn Libraries, versus preprint repositories? We're seeing a rise in preprint repositories, such as our archive, bioarchive, SSRN. Is there a difference in purpose between those repositories? Are those competitive to your institutional repositories? How do you see those fitting in with what you're doing?
Sure. I personally see them as complementary, and I think this gets to the point I made a little bit earlier about the definition of an institutional repository being a bit squishy and hard to pin down. For some universities, an institutional repository is kind of functionally similar to a preprint server in some way. It's a place to put working papers. It's a place where maybe faculty can upload papers, preprints. For others, like Penn, it has that component in a sense, but it's much broader than that, and we're increasingly using our institutional repository to provide permanent public access to the output of scholarship at Penn in all of its manifestations. Not just the written word, not just papers, but also video and audio. We have some 3D sort of stuff, things that you can download and print out, a whole range of materials. An institutional repository is going to generally be dedicated to archiving and providing permanent access to the output of an individual institution, the University of Pennsylvania. A preprint is going to be related to a given discipline, and it's going to be the first stop shop, I guess you could say, for cutting edge research is coming up for quick dissemination right at the point at which it's ready to be shared publicly. And as I mentioned, I think that IRs share some of those components, but generally speaking, they're complementary, and it depends on the institution's I guess commitment to the IR as a platform for all forms of scholarship that you'll see, is when you'll see it as something is not just another type of preprint server.
Okay. Thank you. Another question for you, Kenny. When someone at your institution is searching through your library for an article, does that search automatically return the article, if it's in your institutional repository, return the IR version of it first, or does it go to the VOR? Is there some kind of algorithm that's in place for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you search for something and you have something in the IR and also the VOR, it's gonna point you to the VOR first. The institutional repository is not weighted higher in the search results for our catalog. I'm not, admittedly, the most knowledgeable of how exactly our catalog operates, but from personal experience, it is not weighting it higher. And if there is the VOR through a database subscription or a publisher, it's going to point to that first. The IR will be featured in there, but it's not going to be the #1 result. And I should mention that the vast majority of the people who are finding materials on Scholarly Commons are coming from Google and other sort of public search engines. I don't think that the vast majority of people who are reading materials on our platform aren't doing it through our library catalog. That's just sort of an aside.
Okay.
And I can't speak to what other university catalogs are like. I'm going to assume that they have a similar sort of arrangement where the IR is featured in the catalog, but it's not going to be weighted above the VOR if they're preprints in the repository.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So another question about just for the IRs, if a paper has already been published, you mentioned specifically in there about cataloging previously published older content, content that was published before the launching of Scholarly Commons. Why would you want to put a version of that on Scholarly Commons versus just putting a link to the final version?
Because we are interested in providing permanent public access to those works for which we're legally allowed to share them online. The link could, break, and we're interested in providing the full text access to those works. Scholarly Commons is, largely speaking, a full text repository. And if we're legally allowed to share the full text of that work, we would like to do that. And of course, we're going to include links to the publisher version, to the record where it might live on the journal. But if we're allowed to share the full text version of that, we're interested in doing so, generally speaking.
Okay, great. So do you have a sense for how many of your scholars use the opportunity to load their content into Scholarly Commons? And how much usage does the content on Scholarly Commons receive?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't have like hard statistics on the percentage of faculty members who are using it. It is as I'm sure if you talk to many other librarians, it's sometimes a challenge with marketing, getting the word out. And so we tend to work with folks who have heard about us through our liaison librarians, our subject librarians, other administrators. And as I mentioned, I would say that we get about 50 to 75 faculty members a year who are using this service that we offer, this mediated deposit service. We have recently started to offer it on a departmental basis. So we recently worked with Wharton, the Wharton School here at Penn, to do these permission checks or these publisher policy checks for an entire department. And so that's something that's worked pretty well and something that we'll probably continue to do in the future. I kind of forgot what the second part of your question was. I'm sorry. You mentioned how many faculty are using it, and then what was the second bit?
It was how many are using it, and how much usage does the content on the
Right.
IR receive?
Gotcha. Sorry about that. Our repository, as I mentioned, gets about 2 million downloads per year across those 35,000 objects. It depends. Each individual paper is different. Some will get 2, 3, 4,000 downloads per year. Others might get like 15, 25, 30. It really depends. As you can imagine, things in Wharton are a little bit more popular than maybe like an English department faculty members piece in our collection, just because we don't have that many. But yeah, it really does vary. And some of our more popular pieces actually tend to be those that aren't just preprints of published work, but working papers or issue briefs or research reports that are only published or only available through Scholarly Commons, which, as you can imagine, makes sense.
Okay. Some questions directed for Andrew now. Start with, go back to what is a preprint in the view of Walter Schluer, or a commercial publisher. Do you mean a typeset corrected version? What are the nuances in what's understood as a preprint out there?
So basically what's a preprint is what is originally submitted to the journal. It's what's submitted for consideration. We're a little lenient as far as if the manuscript is accepted. we might allow the preprint to be replaced by the accepted manuscript after the embargo period. But typically when we say preprint, that is just the original manuscript that is submitted to the journal for consideration for publication.
Okay. So you mentioned closed groups of author sharing. You know, some of these, could you go again, just refresh, what was your definition of the closed group? How do you know, you know, since these groups are closed, how do you know that the content's being shared in these groups? Do you generally find out, you know, serendipitously? Are you searching for them?
A little bit of both. I mean, we hear it from some of our society partners, author partners, but for the most part, what we mean by that, when we say closed groups, I mean, obviously, we're never going to be able to tell if the group contains 100 researchers. But basically, when we say that, and I guess this is sort of what Kenny alluded to, or sort of legalese language, what we're referencing is we don't support sites where an article is just posted freely, aside from institutional repositories, where it's posted freely for just anybody to come in and be able to download it and read it. Repositories are fine, but then other sites, collaboration sites, what we're really looking to support are those where you have a research group where one user who's sort of the leader of the group has to invite other researchers to join the group, and they're in a collaborative world where they are sharing within that group. So some collaboration networks, that is the only way they operate. An article can only be shared with those who are within your group, or it can only be shared direct to direct. What we are not fully supportive of are those sites where an article is just posted out for the entire world to be able to come in and freely download at their will.
Okay, thank you. So another question, sort of a technical question, how do you match the preprint DOI with the VOR DOI?
So that's a good question. They would, and not all preprints have DOIs. In some cases they will. So they may not necessarily be matched, but I guess the best answer to that is that we really much encourage adding the VOR DOI to the preprint server. And then as far as the technical aspects of that, I'm not the technical expert here, so I might have to go and research that with some of our experts in-house.
Okay. I've got a question just coming from myself here. With the increase in some fields to publish the data, the raw data that was used to produce the end research, where do both of you see that going as far as, does that data belong in an institutional repository? Is that data something that should be tied to the version of record and restricted by the same rights and sharing policies of the version of record? Is that data something that should be freely shared on collaborative networks? You know, is it an inviolable part of the published VOR article, or is it indeed something that should be more broadly shared for additional interpretation and collaboration?
I think that is a great point to consider, and it's something that we've been tackling with, and we haven't sort of gotten to the right answer yet. And obviously some publishers are more equipped to be able to handle the immense amounts of data that come with it. I think it's a slippery slope when you get into the realm of whether we can apply some sort of non-commercial license to it. So I think in a perfect world, it would be sort of like a preprint or manuscript where it can sit in both the IR and within a publisher's repository, data repository if they have one. But I think the large concern, though, is that if we're making it freely available, then it could be used and altered for a commercial purpose, which may not be as the original researcher intended the information be used. So I think in a perfect world, it sort of lives within both areas, sort of like an accepted manuscript. But I think that's something that me and our publishing partners need to sort of consider and start to make some policies around.
Okay. I've got a question here. Actually, there's two questions I'm going to meld together. The main part of this question comes from a Self-Publishing Society representative who's on the call. And he says that he's a publisher and his society allows institutions to post manuscripts internally. So do you make a difference between, and this is for both of you, Andrew and Kenny, do you make a difference between publishers that will allow internal dissemination of the material versus allowing full publicly available access? And sort of a technical rider to that question, is there an option for publishers to say that you can put an article on IR but just restrict it to the university IP range? Is that even feasible anymore given the different ways that people are accessing their university repositories?
So from a WK perspective, and a lot of scholarly publishers have the similar policy, typically during the embargo period, the 12-month embargo period, manuscripts can only be shared internally. Once the embargo period is up, then it can be added to any external institutional repository. As far as the technical limitations, Kenny would have more insight. I'm not entirely sure if it's even reasonable for an IR to be only internally facing, or if it can be limited in any way.
Okay.
Yeah, I can pick up there. I would say that it's technically possible to upload these materials and make them restricted to an IP range. But generally speaking, we tend to avoid doing that just because it promotes confusion on the part of our users who aren't necessarily on Penn's network but are part of the Penn community, or others who are just generally interested in accessing the materials. So technically we can do that, but I would say that generally we avoid uploading materials for which they're only allowed to be shared internally.
So then, Kenny, just to clarify then, so then in an instance of a WK article, would you just wait until the embargo period is passed and then just post it, or? Yep,
or actually, yes, that, or we actually have a mechanism that allows you to input the embargo date's termination point, when exactly the embargo is over. So we put that in there, and then the record is available, but it's not going to be downloadable until, that date hits and it's automatically made available. So that's what we tend to do for those instances.
Okay. Similar to PubMed Central with journals that have an embargo policy. I have a specific question for Andrew. What is WK's policy for posting content to preprint servers, particularly with regard to the copyright to that content? If it's freely available on a preprint server under a Creative Commons license, will WK journals that require copyright transfer consider the article for publication, consider that it's posted and publicly accessible on a preprint server?
WK will consider those articles, but treating the version that is on the preprint essentially as a preprint. So once it would have to go through the entire CTA process. Copyright would be assigned to the VOR when it publishes. But we would consider manuscripts that are on preprint servers.
Okay. For Kenny, does Penn have an orphan works policy for papers where you can't locate information about the original publisher, or if the original publisher is now defunct?
Yeah, so what we do is we do our absolute best to figure out, if that publisher was purchased or acquired by someone else, get in contact with them, send emails to folks to the best of our ability, or make phone calls. We really do try to figure out if it's still around. If the publisher is verifiably defunct, like we just know that they're no longer around, then we will put that work up in the repository and make note of it in the comments. it's, you know, a good faith effort. If we do hear from the publisher or someone else who has acquired copyright for that work and they want it taken down, we will of course honor that. But generally speaking, we do our absolute best to figure out, you know, if it was acquired by someone and get in contact with them or try to track down the old publisher, that sort of thing.
Okay. So, you know, here's an excellent question, and be interesting to know. I don't necessarily expect either of you will necessarily be able to answer this in your positions, but are you aware, is the media beginning to use bioRxiv or any of these preprint archives or the institutional repositories for their news stories?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Do you mean just using them as material for writing articles about?
Yeah, I mean, in this, just a little bit of background with our own situation at the International Anesthesia Research Society, working in collaboration with our publisher. Full disclosure, Wolters Kluwer is our commercial publishing partner. You know, if we have an article that we know ahead of time we're going to create some press around, we don't publish it ahead of print electronically because, of course, the media would pick that version up first and not pick up the final version when, you know, when we publish it in print as the version of record. So a lot of days, you know, the media might now be picking up on, or are you aware, is the media now beginning to search and pick up on these preprint services and the institutional repositories where a paper may be deposited, you know, months before it ever appears in final publication in a journal, and you know, going with that, because as bioRxiv and medRxiv start to grow, that could be problematic with medical research.
That is a great question. I don't have the answer, but it's definitely something I need to go consider now.
Yeah, I don't think I have any good response to that. I mean, it seems likely, but I don't have any anecdotes to share personally.
Okay. Well, I mean, and in the session on preprint servers at the PSP meeting last week, you know, they made it, the folks from Cold Harbor made it clear that medRxiv is proceeding very slowly because they're trying to negotiate the minefield of questions such as this. So thank you for being candid that you don't have an answer on those. Looking through to see if there are any other questions that we don't have. Andrew and Kenny, are you both willing to share your presentations with the attendees if they request it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay. And with that, I'm just double checking to see if we've covered all the questions. I think there was a question here of can you share examples of good sharing policies, and you know, I don't know that either of you have anything more specific than what you had in your presentations, so perhaps sharing your presentations would answer that question.
Yeah, I hope that my presentation pointed out some of the key things that we look for, you know, from the perspective of librarians working with authors, you know, just policies that really make it abundantly clear what can be shared, where it can be shared, if there's an embargo, you know, what's the time period, and then what exactly is the required statement that needs to be included in there. Just making that really abundantly clear and easy to understand, and also easy to find tend to be the things that, when I'm looking into policies, really strike me as positive policies, those that are easy to find, read, and address those 4 main points.
Okay. I've got one last general question, and this is, are there any significant differences in sharing policies between different scholarly fields, scholarly domains? such as, biomedical versus humanities versus mathematics, economics, physics? Or do they tend to generally be the same?
Yeah, from our perspective, Wolters Kluwer, obviously we're focused solely on healthcare and biomedical, so I can't speak specifically, but from an anecdotal standpoint, I have looked around and checked out the sharing policies of other publishers in other fields, and for the most part, from the high level, sort of what I've spelled out seems to be fairly standard across most scholarly domains. I don't know if Kenny has any other thoughts, because I'm sure he's been exposed to a lot more specific instances.
No, I think that, yeah, generally speaking, you're going to see something pretty similar across the domains. It tends to be, some of the sciences tend to be a little more amenable to sharing those materials more quickly. In humanities, you might see longer embargo periods. Humanities and social sciences, you might see 2-year embargo periods, 2 years plus, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, yeah, you're going to see the ability to share the preprint and then some embargo for other versions.
Okay. And, got a comment from one of the attendees saying that, yes, in math and physics, it's now the norm to share preprints on archive. And again, just anecdotally from the presentation last week, the presenter from archive relayed that, she'd had a conversation with someone about mathematics, and she was coming at it from a point of view from someone on the biomedical side of, well, do you want to publish something that hasn't been resolved yet, that you haven't come to the conclusion with your research? And the mathematician replied to her, I'm working on a problem that was first proposed in the 1700s and still hasn't been resolved, so it's not any state secret if I publish it now. So. Well, I thank you very much for your presentations, and I hope that that our attendees found this information, useful. And we had some excellent questions. Thank you for the attendees for participating in that. And I hope everybody enjoyed this. Jeff, I'll hand it back to you for closing.
Yeah, it's really been excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you to our panelists, Kenny and Andrew, for sharing your expertise with us today. Jason, you did a fantastic job moderating, and thank you to everyone in the audience who submitted those excellent questions. Once again, please do take the time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you'll receive over email. Your feedback will help us to continually improve this webinar program. And also, please join us for the next SSP webinar, March 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern. This is the Scholarly Kitchen webinar discussing the future of the big deal, no deal, or even bigger deal. That includes our presentation for today. Thank you and enjoy your day.